everyone, my name is Rachel. Welcome back to my channel. So it is officially February, and as you can see, I have a really cute red garland with hearts on it, and I'm wearing a red shirt and red makeup. So I'm definitely feeling very festive for the holiday, and I thought as a way to celebrate, I would talk about all of my favorite romances that I read in 2018 and 2019. I think that there's going to be something on this list for everybody, because what I'm going to do is talk about some lighter YA romances, work my way to adult rom-coms, and all the way to really smutty slash darker romances. So let's start with the YA. I have 5 books to talk about, and the first one is going to be The Duff by Kody Keplinger. This is a book that I feel like is maybe a little problematic because it's literally called The Designated Ugly Fat Friend. That's a little bit yikes, but I promise this book is actually really good. So this is about Bianca and Wesley, and Wesley is kind of a bully to Bianca, I guess. So this is kind of like a bully enemies to lover romance, and he basically tells Bianca that she is the duff of her friend group because her other 2 friends are basically models, and Bianca is kind of described as looking plain. And so romance does ensue between the 2 of them. First of all, I really related to Bianca's character. I think all of us can kind of relate to feeling like we are the ugly friend of our group. I don't know, that might be really unhealthy thinking. I've definitely gotten kind of past that as I've gotten older, but I can definitely relate to that feeling, especially in high school and even in college. And this was actually one of my favorite books of 2018, so I definitely recommend it. It's just a fun YA romance. The next one I want to talk about is Starry Eyes by Jenn Bennett. I adore this cover. This is actually my first Jenn Bennett book, and I really loved it. I gave it 4.5 stars, I think. I definitely want to read more of Jenn Bennett's works in the future. I already own Alex Approximately and Serious Moonlight. So this one is about Zori and Lennon. This is kind of a weird situation because it's a friends to, I think, lovers, because I think they started dating. This is all happening before the book starts, but then they become enemies. And so when the book starts, they're enemies, they hate each other, and then they go back to being lovers. So it's a little bit of a complicated story in that way. So they end up going on this group camping trip with some of Zori's friends, but they end up being stranded in the wilderness together, and so they have to find their way out. I really loved the characters in this. Even the side characters were really enjoyable because essentially Zori and Lennon's parents own 2 different businesses, but they're right next door to each other. And I think Zori's parents own like a physical therapy clinic, but Lennon's parents actually own a sex shop. And so that was so funny to read about, just the antics with that. Yeah, this is just such a fun time, but also a really great enemies to lovers romance. I cannot recommend this book enough. And like I said, I really look forward to reading more of Jenn Bennett's books in the future. Next up is Letters to the Lost by Brigid Kemmerer. I talked about this book quite a bit in my favorite books of 2019 video. I will link that up in the cards above, but this is essentially kind of like a heavier, hard-hitting YA romance. It's actually a companion series, but I wanted to just talk about this first book in case you haven't read it. This is about Juliet and Declan, and they meet when Juliet has been leaving letters on her mother's grave, and Declan is doing community service at that cemetery, and he ends up responding to the letters, and that's how their relationship starts. This was just so good. I flew through this. Even though this is like a 400-page book, I read this in like a day or a day and a half, and I just could not give this less than 5 stars. I just highly recommend it. Next up is Autobiography by Christina Lauren. This is actually the first book of theirs that I have read. Christina Lauren is an author duo, and I have to say, this is one of the most well done male YA romances that I have ever read, although I haven't read that many, to be quite honest. But Christina Lauren really did their research with this one, and it's just done so well, and it feels just so authentic. So this is essentially about Tanner and Sebastian has grown up in this community. It's a Mormon community in Utah his whole life, but Tanner has just moved from California. So he's adjusting to being in this completely different environment, being that he is bisexual. The two of them end up meeting when Tanner is basically in like a writing workshop at his high school, and Sebastian, who's only like a year older than him, I think, has already gotten a fantasy novel published. So he comes in to kind of help out with the writing workshop, and the plot goes on from there. Again, I just thought that this was so well done. I did give it 4 stars. I really enjoyed the romance between these two characters, and I know that a lot of people on BookTube really love this book as well. I do wish that Christina Lauren would write more YA, because I do think that they have a knack for it. And the last YA romance I have to talk about is Geekerella by Ashley Poston. Oh my god, this is just such a fun twist on the Cinderella story, as I'm sure you can tell from the title. I could not give this less than 5 stars. I actually listened to the audiobook last year. Elle is essentially a nerd. She's really into this show called Starfield, which is definitely reminiscent of Star Trek. And there is this like Comic-Con like convention called ExcelsiCon, which is based all around the Starfield fandom that her father actually founded, I believe, but at this point in the story her father has passed away, just like in the traditional Cinderella story, and now she's living with her stepmother and stepsisters, and of course they're kind of the worst. And there's this guy Darian who ends up being the lead actor in the Starfield reboot, and so they end up meeting essentially when Elle goes online, I think on her blog, and just bashes Darian and bashes the reboot, and so they just kind of start messaging back and forth, and that's kind of how their romance starts. This was so adorable, such a fun twist on the Cinderella romance. I for sure went into this thinking that it was just going to be a run-of-the-mill fluffy YA romance contemporary, but to me this was so much more than that. This had a lot of heart. This is also a series. The second book, called The Princess and the Fangirl, was also really good. I gave that one 4 stars, and there's a third book I think coming out this year that I think is going to be a Beauty and the Beast retelling. Yeah, this was just so good and went so far beyond what I thought it was going to be. Okay, so now we're going to get more into the adult rom-com romances. So these 3 books I talked about extensively in my favorite books of 2019 video. So again, check that out for more detailed thoughts. But the first one I want to talk about is The Duchess Deal by Tessa Dare. This is the first book in her Girl Meets Duke series. This is by far one of my favorite, if not my absolute favorite, historical romances. Tessa Dare is just an absolute gem in that genre. So this one follows Emma and Ash. Emma is a seamstress. She shows up to Ash's place. He's a duke, and she's wearing this ridiculous wedding dress, and she's like, yo, I need to get paid for making this dress for your ex-fiance. Okay, thanks. Because basically his fiance up and left him after he went through like a tragic accident that left him with scars on his face and on his body. Ash sees her, sees that she's a young and healthy woman, and he's like, hey, do you want to get married? Because like a duke's duty is to produce an heir, and so you could really help me out with that. And she's like, okay. And so that's how this starts. I absolutely adored the romance in this. I'm not going to talk too much about it, but yeah, it's just a phenomenal historical romance. The next one I have is Well Met by Jenda Luca. This is such a fun Renaissance fair romance. This one centers around Emily and Simon, and this is kind of more like an annoyed to lovers. It's definitely not enemies. They just kind of don't really like each other. But Emily ends up moving to the small town. She ends up getting roped into being in this Renaissance fair because her niece wants to be a part of it. And so at the Renaissance fair, she becomes this tavern wench. Simon becomes this swoony pirate, and they have just the best banter, and I loved this romance so much. I couldn't give it less than 5 stars, especially like the last chapter or so like made me tear up. It was just so adorable and just everything that I ever wanted. And after reading this one, I definitely want to read more romances that are centered around a Renaissance fair. The next one is The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang. This was my absolute favorite romance of 2019. I talked about this one a ton, but for those of you guys that don't know, Helen Hoang herself has autism spectrum disorder, and so the main character Stella also has autism spectrum disorder, so this is own voices, and it's really well done. This is essentially a reverse Pretty Woman. Stella ends up hiring this male escort named Michael to teach her about all things love and sex related, and it's just so much more than that, and I absolutely adored the characters and the story and just everything. Helen Hoang has quickly become one of my auto-buy authors because she's only written 2 books, but they are both phenomenal. And speaking of that other book, another favorite romance of 2019 for me was The Bride Test by Helen Hoang, and this is essentially a companion novel to The Kiss Quotient, and this one centers around Kai, who was actually Michael's cousin. He was kind kind of in the kiss quotient, but I think we only see him like once or twice and like for a couple of seconds. But this is his romance with this girl named Esme. Kai's mother goes to Vietnam to essentially get a mail order bride for him, and she meets Esme and just knows that she's the perfect woman for him. I adored both characters in this as well. I just think Helen Hoang writes characters so well, and the stories are so great and also swoon worthy, and I love the autism spectrum disorder representation that we have going on here. I think out of all of these romances, these by far are the two that you definitely need to check out if you haven't yet. Next book I want to talk about is Good Luck Charm by Helena Hunting. This was such a good second chance hockey romance. I was so here for it. So this is about Ethan and Lila, and essentially they dated when they were in high school and they loved each other. But unfortunately, Ethan ended up breaking up with Lila over the phone because his father persuaded him to, in order to fully devote himself to his hockey career. And so now he's back in town. I think Lila is a nurse or a doctor, I can't quite remember. So she has stayed in their hometown after going to med school, and this is their second chance at love. This was just a really fun time. I gave it 4 stars. I definitely want to check out more of Helena Hunting's works in the future because I know that she writes a lot of great hockey romances. So now we are getting into the really smutty books, and so the first one I'm going to talk about is Fix Her Up by Tessa Bailey. This one is pretty well known around BookTube. A lot of people have been reading this one recently. This one is essentially about Georgie, who is pretty much a clown. She is an entertainer for kids' birthday parties, and I loved her character especially because she really has these big ambitions for essentially opening up her own company for birthday party entertainment. And then we have Travis here, who was a Major League Baseball player, but he hurt his shoulder and so he's no longer in the game, but he gets offered a job as a baseball game commentator. So essentially they go into this fake dating kind of situation because they both want to be taken more seriously by the people in their lives. And oh man, was this book smutty. I adore smutty romances, but this one is by far one of the smuttiest books I've ever read. Sex scenes in this were actually quite dirty, and I was here for it because I love reading adult romances that span of all spectrums of the amount of smut, I guess. But yeah, this is definitely not for people who don't like smut. Do not let the illustrated cover fool you, but this was such a fun time. This is actually a series. The second book, called Love Her or Lose Her, actually came out like a week or 2 ago, and I definitely plan on reading that one soon as well. So now we're getting into the darker romances. I'm going to be talking about 2 books by Tiffany Reese, who has quickly become one of my favorite erotic romance authors. And the first book I want to talk about is Picture Perfect Cowboy. This was actually an arc that I got off of NetGalley back in 2018, I think. And this was just such a good time. It's essentially a cowboy romance with BDSM. It's just so well done. So this one centers around Jason Waters, who is a bull rider and also a cowboy.
I want to be a cowboy, baby. Hell yeah. I want to be a cowboy, baby.
And he meets this woman named Simone, who is a photographer. She ends up taking pictures of him, I think for like a bull rider calendar or magazine or something like that. So Simone is into BDSM, and she quickly discovers that Jason might be a dom and he might be into BDSM as well. This book is essentially all about Simone educating Jason about BDSM and their developing relationship. I loved the romance in this, but also this is very smutty as well. Most of Tiffany Reese's are very smutty, but I was just so here for this book, and honestly I want to reread it at some point because that's how much I enjoyed it. And then the other book of hers that I want to talk about is The Siren, and this is the first book in the original Sinner series. Picture Perfect Cowboy is also a part of this series, but it's not part of the main plot line of the series, if that makes sense. It's kind of like a spin-off. But The Siren is the first book of the actual series, and this whole series centers around Nora Sutherland, who is an erotic romance author, and her on and off kind of relationship with this man named Surin, who is a priest. So there's definitely a taboo element to this. But what I love is that the characters are actually well developed. Tiffany Reese does a phenomenal job of educating her readers about what BDSM actually is. I do think that a lot of people have a skewed view of what it is after reading the disaster that is the 50 Shades of Grey series. So I love reading books like this that are actually done right. And yes, there's plenty of smut in these books, but at at the same time, the plots are so well done too, so I think there's definitely a good balance between those two aspects. And yeah, I cannot recommend Tiffany Reese enough. I can't recommend this series enough. It's just so good. So if you're into darker romances, definitely check this one out if you haven't yet. All right, guys, that's going to be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope that you also found some books from this list that you would be interested in reading if you haven't yet. I would love it if you would consider subscribing and pushing that like button, and I thank you in advance if you do. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye!